A rogues gallery for a hero can sometimes be almost as important as the hero themselves because they are the enemies that the hero goes up against in every single story. They almost define who the character is going to be, but also in a lot of instances, what they stand for. And a lot of times amongst comic fans, the debate happens who has the best rogues gallery, and without fail, almost every single person will name one of two rogues galleries, that being Batman or Spider-Man. And although I think we can all agree that these two heroes have some of the best villains within their respective rogues galleries, I feel like a lot of them are specifically tailored to their hero. So what would happen if hypothetically we mixed up the rogues gallery with the hero they were fighting? What if instead of Spider-Man having to combat his normal rogues gallery, how would he fare against someone else's? And conversely, how would Batman handle someone else's rogues gallery? And that's why today we're talking Batman versus the Sinister Six. But before we get into anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Alright, Batman versus the Sinister Six. First and foremost, most importantly, we need to establish which version of these characters we are going with. As you all know, I absolutely love the DCAU, so that is the version of Batman we are going to go with. And for the version of the Sinister Six, realistically, I feel like we have three options if we are taking from animation. And in my opinion, the Sinister Six was great in Spider-Man 1994. However, they are somewhat hard to scale, so I'm actually going to go with the version from Spectacular Spider-Man, which was actually a really awesome rendition of those characters as well. So now we have the established characters. However, we also have to determine which characters are going to create the Sinister Six, because a lot of times there are different characters that make up the Sinister Six in Spider-Man. So with this version, we are going to go with the Green Goblin at number 1, Venom at number 2, Doc Ock at number 3, the Rhino at number 4, Kraven at number 5, and coming in at the last spot, we have Sandman at number 6. In this scenario, we are going to have Batman face off one-on-one with each of these characters, starting at the number 6 spot. This will be a random encounter. Batman will not have any prior knowledge, so let's just get right into it. Starting with Batman versus Sandman. Now, a lot of people are probably going to find this to be pretty contentious. However, the reason that I put Sandman last, I think this is actually Batman's easiest battle on this list for a couple of reasons. Number one, Sandman probably has the lowest IQ aside from Rhino on this list, and not to mention the fact that he has a ton of weaknesses that are very similar to the weaknesses of Clayface. How does Batman deal with Clayface? A lot of times he uses electricity or ice. He freezes Clayface in multiple stories. And how is Sandman defeated in multiple scenarios against Spider-Man? Even in this show, he is frozen multiple times. And not only that, we also see that electricity has effects on Sandman. So if hypothetically Batman were to randomly run into Sandman, he would have the equipment on him to deal with this enemy. Keep in mind, this is a version of Batman that we are using from the end of Justice League Unlimited. And by this point, Batman quite literally keeps on him gauntlets that create electricity, not to mention multiple gadgets that can freeze things. We're not going to give him his Batplane in this scenario because that would just be absolutely cheap considering the fact that he has the equipment on his plane that could freeze the entire Gotham River. So if he had his plane, it would be over in less than 10 seconds. However, with that being said, even going into combat against Sandman, his gauntlets that create electricity would be able to nullify to a degree Sandman's sand. This is shown when Sandman tries to free Electro when Rhino is on top of him. He can't get too close because the electricity disrupts his sand. Now, another thing that disrupts his sand is vibrational frequency. I don't know if Batman would be able to deduce this and then design something in this first encounter, so I won't give that as a win state. However, considering the fact that he could very easily electrify Sandman and then end up freezing him in order to trap and stop him, I feel like this would be a relatively easy win for Batman. So for this one, I would say 9 times out of 10, he would be able to defeat Sandman. I will be rating each villain with how many times out of 10 I think Batman would be able to stop them in a random encounter. Anytime over 6, I will give Batman the win. If it is a 50-50 split or even 6 times out of 10, I would actually lean that more towards the villain because the hero should way more times than not be able to stop the bad guy. So because this is a video to to determine if Batman could properly handle Spider-Man's rogues gallery, I want it to be almost in a landslide that he can. However, we need the facts to back it up. So, with all that being said, let's get into our number 5 contestant. We have Batman versus Kraven the Hunter. And this one I have above Sandman for a couple of reasons. So in this series, Kraven does get an upgrade. So for the sake of argument, we're going to have Batman go up against both versions of Kraven. And when he goes up against just the normal version of Kraven, he is going to absolutely obliterate Kraven. Kraven is not going to have anything in his kit that can stop Batman. He is not going to be able to use all of his weapons against Batman. Batman has quite literally gone up against some of the most formidable foes by this point that someone like Kraven is going to be absolute child's play for him. So to me, I feel like Batman wins 10 times out of 10 going against the normal version of Kraven. I just feel like his battle IQ, his wit, his determination, not to mention his fighting ability mixed with all of his gadgets would be way too much for Kraven to deal with. However, when Kraven does eventually get his upgrades in this series, he is way stronger and way faster. He also has a lot of the senses that an animal has, so this would be way more difficult for Batman, and it would actually nullify some of Batman's kit, like him using the shadows to hide from Kraven or trying to sneak up on him. These would be tactics that would not work. However, Batman would also take note of Kraven's heightened senses, and I feel like he would actually use those against Kraven, and he wouldn't try to attack Kraven directly. I feel like instead he would try to affect Kraven's senses. We have seen that Batman has multiple gadgets like a flashbang, like a smoke grenade. And yes, I know a smoke grenade wouldn't really do anything because Kraven could still sense him. However, it would at the very least throw off Kraven's smell, and not to mention if you mix that with a flashbang, and then we do know that Batman does have different types of knockout gases. Considering Kraven's heightened senses and the fact that his nose is incredibly sensitive after he is upgraded, if he inhales any amount of knockout gas, he would be weakened to a degree that Batman could go up to him and punch him multiple times to knock him out. And in my opinion, that would result in Kraven losing this battle 8.5 times out of 10. However, that being said, I feel like this next fight is going to be even tougher for Batman. And that's because at number 4 in this battle, we have Batman versus the Rhino. Now, the Rhino is really interesting in this series. He realistically has no weaknesses aside from 2. One being how absolutely stupid he is, and that is shown pretty much every single time he is on screen. He is not intelligent. From the time he is first introduced as a low-level thug, all the way up until the point he becomes the Rhino and eventually joins the Sinister Six, he is without a doubt the stupidest member of the Sinister Six and the stupidest villain that Spider-Man faces off against. I feel like this is going to end up being his kryptonite in the end. Now, one of the things Batman is going to struggle with is the sheer power of the Rhino and the fact that he is incredibly quick. Batman is going to take a lot of damage in this fight, and if he takes too much damage, he is going to be out of commission. This is a one-off fight, so Batman can't escape to come back later and take him down. He has to do it now. So with that being said, I feel like his clear win state would be pretty much exactly how Spider-Man ended up defeating the Rhino. In their first encounter, although the Rhino seems unbeatable because his armor is quite literally impenetrable, and this is something that he actually states, which ends up being his very undoing. Because Spider-Man hears this, and then he starts to realize something. The Rhino is not only out of breath, but he is sweating profusely. And not only is he sweating profusely, he continuously stops the fight to hydrate himself. Pour water all over his face, and this, in my opinion, would be Batman's epiphany. He would realize in this moment that the Rhino is sweating for his entire body out of just his face. And this is something that Spider-Man realizes as well. So he uses this to his advantage. He lures him to a steam shaft, and that steam shaft becomes way too much for the Rhino to deal with, especially after Spider-Man starts to break open some of the pipes and unleash even more steam upon Rhino to the point where he passes out because his face is no longer enough to sweat for his entire body. His incredibly durable armor that is impenetrable actually becomes his greatest weakness in this moment. And that's something Spider-Man quite literally states in this moment. He says, yes, your armor is impenetrable, but that's actually the issue with it. Because if there are no separations, if there is truly no way for anything to penetrate your armor, that means air also cannot penetrate it. And that also means that sweat cannot penetrate it. So your face is doing the sweating for your entire body. So if Batman would be able to lure Rhino into some type of steam vent to take him down, I feel like he could pretty easily beat him in this moment. Not to mention the fact that Batman has a myriad of gadgets that can create multiple explosions that can generate a ton of heat that could lead to Rhino getting taken down eventually. However, as I mentioned before, I feel like if Rhino genuinely catches Batman at all during this fight and is able to land multiple hits on him, Batman's going to be out of commission. So right there, I feel like that automatically gives Rhino 2 wins right off the bat. Not to mention, it is going to take some effort to lure Rhino down to the steam tunnel. And if he's not able to do it, it will take even more effort to take down Rhino. So I feel like Batman does win this battle. However, it will not be as decisive as the other ones. In my opinion, I will give him a 7.5 out of 10. 7.5 times out of 10, he would defeat the Rhino. One of those times would come at the expense of Batman's body. I feel like he would be pretty bruised, battered, and broken by the end of it. However, still coming out on top. And that's pretty much all that matters in these battles. But all that being said, coming in at number 3 on our battles list, we have Batman versus Doc Ock. So this one is going to be a lot different than the other one because Doc Ock is far smarter than the Rhino, but he's also way more fragile than the Rhino. So this battle would essentially come down to if Doc Ock would be able to outsmart Batman and also keep Batman away from him. Because this version of Doc Ock has one glaringly obvious weakness, especially throughout this series. It is quite literally on his stomach. All Spider-Man had to do was hit the centerpiece and take out the battery, and his arms no longer worked. And once that happened, Doc Ock was just a guy. He was just a scientist, and if you think that Batman, after doing this, would have any trouble beating the brakes off of a helpless scientist, you don't know Batman, because he's dealt the blows to Hugo Strange. He does not care. And that's why, although I feel like from a strategic standpoint, this battle would be more difficult than the battle against the likes of the Rhino, I feel like once Batman deduces the power source of Doc Ock's arms, which is pretty obvious considering there's a giant circle on his stomach, and you can quite literally see his entire harness, it would not take much for Batman to realize how to stop this enemy. And once he does realize this, the arms would be tricky for him to navigate. However, he has defeated enemies that could keep him at bay to a degree. Poison Ivy's kit is quite literally controlling plants. Those are multiple vines, and Batman has had to deal with that. Whereas in this scenario, it's just 4 tendrils coming at you. So I feel like once Batman is able to come up with a strategy to maneuver his way through Doc Ock's tentacles and get to his power source, the fight would be over relatively quickly. He might not even need to take Doc Ock's battery out. He might be able to just use those electrified gauntlets and punch right through Doc Ock's harness, or at the very least, punch with enough force and electricity to disrupt the arms, to deactivate them at least for a little bit. And even if you deactivate them for only 20 seconds, Batman would be able to absolutely thrash Doc Ock without the use of his arms in under 20 seconds with no issue. So I feel like even though this one is above the Rhino as far as difficulty, I feel like he wins this fight 8 times out of 10. The only reason I have it above the battle with the Rhino is because of Doc Ock's IQ, and he might be able to keep Batman at bay for long enough to at least create some win states. However, if he doesn't do this in any sort of meaningful way, he is going to get taken out relatively easily because at his core, Doc Ock is just a guy. Take out the arms, he's an ordinary scientist, and Batman would absolutely demolish him. However, we cannot say that for our next entry on this list, because coming in at number 2 on this battle scenario, we have Batman versus Venom. So this one is going to be incredibly difficult. Honestly, number 1 and 2 on this list could have been interchangeable, because I could see an argument as to why both of these characters could be too much for Batman to handle. However, the 2 important distinctions that we have to have between the 2 characters that I have at number 1 and number 2 are the weaknesses. Venom in this universe is inherently weak to 2 things. Number 1, sound, which symbiotes are almost weak to in every single storyline. However, he also has a weakness towards fire. Any type of extreme heat is going to cause him excruciating pain and do some serious damage to the symbiote suit. And considering the fact that by the time of the end of Justice League Unlimited, Batman is essentially a walking arsenal, him creating any type of major heat source is not going to be an issue, even if he doesn't have any of his Batmobiles or Batplanes or the Batboat there to use. He has everything he needs on his utility belt. Now, the issue is going to be, unlike Rhino, landing those attacks on Venom. Venom is far more agile than Rhino. Venom is far quicker than Rhino. Not to mention the fact that he can use webs. He could web Batman up. He is clearly stronger than Batman. The symbiote is pretty resilient. It doesn't have the inherent weakness that Rhino's suit had. So Batman couldn't turn this into a war of attrition. In fact, I feel like a battle of attrition would actually probably benefit Venom even more so than Batman, as he would use up all of his gadgets in this hypothetical long-lasting battle to the point where he is ineffective against Venom. However, that being said, I feel like there are still win states, as I mentioned at the beginning of this fight. Batman is essentially a walking armory by the end of the series, so if he is able to use a myriad of his gadgets to knock Venom off balance, and if some of these are able to land, the symbiote is going to, in some parts of Eddie Brock, retract itself, and that is going to lead to parts of Eddie Brock being exposed. And although Eddie Brock is built like a brick shithouse in this series, him compared to a peak version Batman is going to be absolutely nothing. So I feel like Batman's strategy in this scenario would be to use a myriad of different explosions to try to knock Venom off balance, and at the same time try to knock pieces of the symbiote off of Eddie Brock. And as this happens, Batman would try to, as quickly as possible, go up to Venom and punch the parts of him that are exposed, doing some serious damage. And another thing we have to note is that the symbiote in this universe has shown at least some weakness to electricity, but it's more so a vulnerability to electricity than an actual weakness. However, that being said, the fact that Batman has two gauntlets that he always carries on his person that create electricity, if he pairs this with his myriad of different explosions to go against Venom, I feel like he would be able to land some pretty divisive blows. And if he is able to land one or two of those punches that have the electrified gauntlets against Venom in any of his exposed areas, he is going to knock him out. Eddie Brock is just a person. If he gets punched from Batman, not only would it hurt, but it would be an electrified punch. So taking one to two of those blows would be enough to knock him unconscious. So I feel like although this battle would definitely be the most difficult that Batman has had up to this point, I feel like there are still more win states for Batman than there are for Venom. So I feel like in this scenario, I will give Batman a 6.5 out of 10 as far as how many times he is able to defeat Venom. That 0.5 is still going to be a victory for Batman. However, it is going to come at the expense of himself, as he is going to be very much so bruised, battered, and almost out of commission at the end of that battle. However, he still is able to take down Venom. So up till this point, Batman can handle Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery. However, that might all change when we talk about our next entry, because number one on this list of the battle scenario, we have Batman versus the Green Goblin. So the Green Goblin is essentially a super soldier on steroids. And considering the fact that Batman has gone up against some pretty incredibly powerful characters, especially by this point, he might be able to deal with this to a degree and might be able to go blow for blow with the Goblin to a degree. However, I feel like if he takes any sustainable damage from the Green Goblin, he is not going to be able to continue this fight. And you also pair that with the fact that Norman Osborn is quite literally a genius. Not to mention the fact that the Goblin formula in this universe is confirmed to heighten IQ. So this is a version of the Green Goblin that already was inherently smart that got a boost to his intelligence, putting him possibly past the level of Doc Ock and past the level of Batman's IQ. This version of Green Goblin is incredibly formidable and incredibly smart, not to mention all of the gadgets that he does have. The pumpkin bombs, the pumpkin knives that come out and they will follow his enemy, not to mention his glider. And also he has gloves in this universe that he can simply point to someone and lasers fire out of them, and they do damage to Spider-Man. So it would stand to reason that if he were to point at Batman at any point and any of those lasers were to land on Batman, Batman would be not only very much so hurt, but he actually might be taken out of commission from just that attack. So considering that, we have to give Green Goblin multiple win states right off the bat. One as far as IQ, one as far as strength, and two as far as his kit. So right off the bat, Batman is already up against it, only having the possibility to get 7 out of 10 win states, and even that is going to be a stretch. Batman doesn't have any clear strategy to take down the Green Goblin. The Green Goblin has no inherent weakness. There's no electricity that's going to affect him like it affected Venom, like it affected Rhino. He doesn't have any glaringly obvious weakness with his suit like Doc Ock. In fact, his suit is more of an accessory aside from his gloves and aside from his glider. And speaking of his glider, that's also going to be something that would be very difficult for Batman to compete with. In this universe, he doesn't have that flight mech suit. He only has it one time and it gets destroyed in the world's finest crossover episodes. And past that point, we realistically don't see it, aside from one flashback, but even in that flashback, it gets destroyed again. So it would stand to reason that Batman doesn't have any capability to actually fly, so he is getting outmaneuvered by the Green Goblin. And considering the fact that the Green Goblin seemingly has an endless supply of pumpkin bombs on him, he could just shower Batman with pumpkin bombs to the point where Batman is out of commission. This also is going to create a win state for the Green Goblin. Now we are officially at Batman only having 6 possible win states against the Green Goblin. Now, if we're talking actual hand-to-hand combat, although Green Goblin is going to be considerably stronger than Batman, I feel like if he does use those electrified gauntlets, he would be able to land decisive blows against the Green Goblin. And if you were asking me who I think is a more gifted physical fighter, Batman or the Green Goblin, I will 10 times out of 10 say it is Batman, especially this version of Batman. Now, we also have to take into account the enemies that Batman has been able to go against, and the fact that a lot of them are super powered, and a lot of them do have either super durability or some level of super strength. So considering that, he is not a stranger to dealing with enemies like this. So I feel like this experience would also lead to Batman being able to come up with a couple victories in this scenario. I feel like in best case scenario, he would be able to win 5 out of 10 of these battles, and it would be a 50-50 split as far as who would win between Batman and the Green Goblin. I feel like the Green Goblin just has way too much in his arsenal for Batman to deal with, to be able to have that many decisive victories. And if Spider-Man and Batman were to hypothetically switch rogues galleries, Green Goblin would definitely be the villain that gave Batman the most difficulty, and he would be someone that challenges him similarly to how the Joker challenges him. Except unlike the Joker, the Green Goblin would be able to back up a lot of that psychological damage with physical damage as well. And he might even become a more formidable foe than the Joker, even though he is not quite as crazy as the Joker. So the psychological aspect and the psychological damage would likely be lessened than the effects that the Joker has on Batman. However, even still, if you combine the physical attributes of the Green Goblin with everything that he is going to be able to do with Batman from a mental and psychological standpoint, he is still going to be an incredibly formidable adversary. And in my opinion, he is the reason that Batman would not be able to switch rogues with Spider-Man. So all in all, I feel like Batman would be able to handle a majority of Spider-Man's villains. However, when it comes down to it, the top villains in Spider-Man's rogues gallery are going to be too much for Batman. Even Venom might end up being too much for him, not to mention Carnage, who we would get down the line as well, I feel like would also be a little bit too much for Batman. However, all that being said, the determining factor in this scenario would without a doubt be the Green Goblin. I feel like he would just be too much for Batman to handle on a day-to-day basis, and considering the fact that he would have a 50-50 split as far as wins and losses against the Green Goblin, you would not want Batman to switch rogues with Spider-Man. However, if we did give him prep time, it might be a different story. But I'm interested to hear from all of you. Do you think Batman could handle Spider-Man's rogues, or do you think I'm right and at the end of the day, the rogues would just end up being too powerful for Batman, at least at the top? Let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And I'll see all of you in the next video. Goodbye.